you before. I've been with Frank since 1980, 2015 or so. Okay, I am a director of Region 6 for the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. And it's a project, okay? And today we are doing a Zoom PowerPoint presentation on the Bataan Death March by Frank. To say something about Frank, in 1946, he served as a second lieutenant with the 57th Infantry of the Filipino Scouts at Camp O'Donnell. Usually you say it Camp O'Donnell, but in this language, it's Camp O'Donnell. And it was a formal Japanese POW camp. As time went on, Frank learned from the survivors about the atrocities of the Bataan Death March and of various other POW camps. Frank has fought for decades for Filipino stateside, advocating for better recognition for their service. On October 25th, 2017, Frank was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal along with other surviving veterans or next of kin in Washington, D.C. Frank is giving this presentation to acquaint all about the Bataan Death March, the failure of the U.S. government to recognize the sacrifices of the veterans, both Filipinos and Americans, who fought in the Philippines, and to identify those who may be eligible for the Congressional Gold Medal for their service in the Philippines. I now present you Frank Francone, my friend.
Thanks, Mike.
Mhm.
I presume you all can hear me now. As it's a real honor to be doing this. It's an experiment in a way, and I'm blessed to be able to continue with this because it's been an item on my heart for some time. My purpose is I want to provide a history of what happened on the Bataan Death March. And surprisingly enough, fewer and fewer people seem to know what happened there. Not only do they not know what happened there, but you find among high school students, there are a lot of them that don't even know what happened on December the 7th. And this is just a continuation of a significant event that occurred thereafter. Of course, I want to memorialize those who sacrificed so much to preserve our freedom. And as Mike said, we want to locate veterans or families who are eligible for the Congressional Medal, and we'll cover that. And then Mike will give you viewers an opportunity to participate in correcting some of the injustices that were perpetrated on the Filipino veterans. Okay, I want to bring up my screen now. And just take a second here to come on. Let's see.
You're good. We can see it.
Yeah, but I don't have the. Come on. No, I'll just pull this down. Okay. Actually, we wouldn't normally have this trouble, but I'm just showing it how.
You
to
got
make it
it.
look like this has been difficult. You understand?
You got
Okay.
it, Frank. It's good.
Okay, good.
It's perfect.
Okay, so this is my opening screen, and it's intended just to cover the things that I've mentioned today, and we'll get into the details of the rest of this picture, for example. Okay. So the opening days of World War II that have all appeared on, as far as the Americans were concerned, was on December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor and caused so much damage there. It seems like, so how long was it before they attacked some of the rest of the area that they were concerned with? It was like 9 hours later. It wasn't a day later or a month later. They, in that tremendous effort, a magnificent, huge effort, they undertook to attack not only Pearl Harbor, but 9 hours later, they were attacking Malaysia, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Their aircraft, they attacked the Philippine air bases, including Nichols, Iba, and Clark Field. And then by December the 8th, they had landed troops on Philippine land. Now, see, someone had a globe on their picture the other day, just a little earlier, but this is another representation of some of the events that occurred. And turns out that on December 7th, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Then on the 8th, they attacked Malaysia, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. And this is just an attempt to show you where those are located on this globe. Let's see. And you should realize that between the two furthest objects on that globe, Wake Island and Malaysia, they're 4,500 miles apart. That compares, let's say, with the distance from New York to San Francisco, 2,900 miles. So just to get a feel for how huge this effort was on the part of the Japanese, and what huge amount of the globe of the earth were they attacking and putting under their control. Now, of course, one of the major areas of concern was the Clark Field event. And that within those 9 hours that I mentioned earlier, the Japanese sent 26 Mitsubishi G3M bombers and 27 Mitsubishi G4M bombers over the Philippines. Now, I say that it took them 9 hours before they were starting attacking, but as it happened, they would have attacked even sooner, but there were some fog issues at Formosa where they were parked, and so it delayed their action some. But so that gave the United States, the Americans, additional time to prepare for the coming attacks from Japan. But as it happens, for various reasons, and there's been a lot of written about that, the 9 hours was basically wasted, and there was no preparation, no use was taken of the opportunity of those 9 hours. It turns out actually that the people who found out about the Pearl Harbor event in the Philippines found it on commercial radio. That was the way they themselves learned that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. So these bombers came over Clark Field, and they actually dropped 636 kilogram bombs on Clark Field alone. They were also attacking other of the airfields in the Philippines. Then after the bombers had gone over the area at least twice, then in came these Zero fighters, and they strafed the undamaged planes that were still on the runway. You say, well, why didn't the field artillery prevent these bombs, at least attempt to attack these bombers? But the bombers were somewhat unique in that they could fly at 20,000 feet. And it turns out that the artillery defenses at Clark Field were unable to be effective at 20,000 feet. Not only that, but it turns out that a lot from the Coast Artillery people found that the ammo that they had was almost ineffective. Only about 1 out of every 6 of the shells that they fired was able to explode. So there were a lot of issues, that America was really not prepared for this attack. Now, what I just do is give some picture as to what happened there Of the 17 B-17s that were on the ground, 12 of them were destroyed and 4 were damaged. One of them escaped damage altogether. Of the 11 B-17s had been flown to Mindanao before the raid, and 5 more reached there on the day of the attack. So this was just a fortunate situation where some of the bombers had not been damaged because by accident they had been flown off to Mindanao. And then the P-40s, the pursuit planes of America at that time, were pretty ineffective against the Japanese Zero planes. And we lost a lot of those. And then the older P-35s and P-6s, which were there and basically obsolete, were going to be used for observation and so forth. Had they survived, they could have helped. And I mean, it's significant enough to see these airplanes and these planes and the damage that occurred. But the important thing is that by not having these aircraft, any infantry or ground troops of the Americans and the Filipinos were basically unprotected. They had no umbrella of aircraft over them that could prevent the Japanese strafing them, bombing them, wiping out their machine gun placements. It just left the American and Filipinos basically uncovered. Okay, so this is what I want to do now is just cover the situation that the Japanese, what their view of what was going on at the time. For example, Japan's war with China, it had been going on for about 10 years already. And it turns out that in this war, Japan was very dependent on the resources that had been provided by the US and Great Britain for several years. And so finally the US and Great Britain determined to endorse economic sanctions against Great Britain and Netherlands. I'm sorry, not against Great Britain, but the United States, Great Britain, and Netherlands were going to cut off all strategic materials necessary to continue their war with China. Then you'd say, well, after all, Great Britain was a colonial power, a huge power in this area, but they really were not a huge power anymore. They were busy in the Atlantic fighting with the Germans, and they were in no position to defend any of their resources that were in the Pacific region. The important thing is that the natural resources that Japan needed were in the Netherlands Indies and would meet Japanese military needs. And by wiping out the British sectors and eliminating the Philippines as a protective source place, then the Japanese would have easy access to the resources in the Netherlands. Acquiring these resources, of course, meant war with Great Britain, the Netherlands, and probably the United States. Okay, now I want to talk a little about what their strategy was. How were they planning to accomplish all of this? Their immediate plan, of course, was to attack Pearl Harbor and to neutralize the US naval power. And they obviously accomplished that. They were to attack Great Britain's colonies in Singapore, Malaya, and giving them access to the Dutch-controlled Netherlands. They were now going to attack the Philippines, which was a major resource of the Americans, and it was the only major presence that we had in the Pacific region. Then they were going to attack Guam and Wake Island, primarily because they were communication on lines of communication across the Pacific for the Americans. So their plan was to go ahead and undertake all this very rapidly to the point that they would do this in a way that it would present the United States with an almost invincible posture. Now, I'm heavy in the timelines, and I'll have, I think, 3 timelines here. This first one is a timeline showing the plan that the Japanese had for the conquering and conquest of the Philippines. So they had planned for December 41. By January of 42, they had planned to have occupied and have complete control of the Philippines. So I'm now going to display what their plan consisted of. First, bomb Pearl Harbor, then bomb the Philippine Islands, then establish and maintain air superiority over this whole period, then land 40,000 troops on Luzon. Luzon is the major island of the Philippines, and we'll talk about it quite a bit more. Then land another 45,000 troops and 90 tanks in Lingayen Gulf on Luzon about Christmas time. Land some more troops on Luzon, occupy Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines, Bataan, and the Corregidor, and all that by January of 42. And then have a big party. Okay, so the question now is, what was our resources in terms of military in the Philippines in January of 42? First, there was what was called the Philippine Army. It had been activated in 1936, but it was basically untrained and poorly armed, in some cases with World War I weapons. Then there was the Philippine Constabulary. This was a different unit, and it basically was the military rendition of the police academy of the Philippines. And so they were basically the policemen or the law enforcement sector of the Philippine government. Then there was a 4th Regiment of Marines, U.S. regiment. There was another regiment in the U.S. Army. Then there were 2 Coast Artillery units, and then the Air Corps, and a bomber group, and many non-combat trained military units, medical, logistics, those type of people. Now, it turns out that these 2 Coast Artillery units are rather interesting to us here. They came from a guard unit out of New Mexico. There were about 1,800 men involved in these 2 units. They were one of the first groups to actually get engaged in combat with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. And after the war, first, there were about 1,800 men in those 2 groups. After the war, only half of those men were able to return to their homes in New Mexico. Of those 900 men, about half of them never lived more than a year. So it's always impressed me to realize that this small community, I mean, New Mexico was only had about 500,000 people, I think, in Albuquerque, which was the capital. They lost over almost 2,000 families, don't have fathers, kids that didn't have fathers, mothers that didn't have sons, families that were, and look at it as an individual is bad enough, but to look at it in terms of the magnitude of this group of people and the sacrifice that they made. Now, besides this, there was also a group of what we call the Philippine Scout, and I'll talk more about these later, but they were part of the United States Army, and they represented about 10% of the defending army on Bataan. There was one field artillery unit. The PS means Philippine Scout. There was the 26th Cavalry, which became very famous, and then 2 infantry regiments. It happens that this regiment here, the 57th, is the one that I was later assigned to. So it's the reason I have a heart for what's going on here. And I'll talk more about this. Who are the Philippine Scouts? This is just an abbreviated history. They are not a Boy Scouts, as some people feel. They were a military organization, part of the United States Army that was formed in 1901, and will continue service until the end of World War II. This is a significant point here. In 1941, President Roosevelt enlisted the Filipino and the Filipino-American soldiers to serve under the U.S. authority during World War II. And as part of that enlistment, they were promised all of the benefits that an American soldier of any other unit in the United States Army or Navy was to be awarded. The Philippine Scout regiments became the first U.S. Army units to be in combat during World War II because they were fighting the Japanese on December 10th, I believe. Okay, there were 3 Philippine Scouts who received the Medal of Honor. The Philippine Scouts were basically Filipinos. All the troops were Filipinos, and they were armed and trained by U.S. forces. And most of the officers were United States Army officers. For example, I was one of those officers. Okay, now we'll be looking at some of the battle situation, what had happened and where it happened, and try to tell you when. This is a picture of Luzon, which is the main island in the Philippines. It's the largest island. Manila is down here. The Bataan Peninsula is right here. Corregidor is just off the tip here of the Bataan Peninsula, and it was intended to guard the Manila Bay. And there was so on December the 8th, the Japanese landed troops on Bataan Island, which was a small Filipino island off of the north tip of Luzon. There were about 7,600 islands in the Philippines. So this is just one of those 7,600 up there. Only about 2,000 of the islands were considered occupied at that time, but Luzon is the big island, and it's the one where the capital, Manila, was. So on the 8th, they landed troops essentially on the Philippines. Also, they commenced to attack Clark Field as well as Nichols Field and Iba Field, and other aircraft landing fields, not only on Luzon, but also on some of the other islands like Mindanao, for example. Okay, so on the 10th, the Japanese then began to land troops at Vigan. And then the troops that had been up here on Bataan were now transported over to Apari. So there were Japanese troops down here at Vigan and Apari. Then these troops commenced moving southward across the Luzon Peninsula. The goal was to take over Manila. Then on the 22nd of December, they migrated down to Rosario or near San Fernando. And on the 22nd of December, they landed 23,000 troops and 90 tanks on Lingayen Gulf. Now, besides those troops that landed, of course, there was a whole armada of naval vessels out here with cannons firing on and preparing the land for a safe landing. And it turns out, this gets a little complicated, but MacArthur's plan for defending Luzon was that he would have troops and supplies and food and so forth located throughout the beaches of Luzon, because he figured they would be landing at the but he really didn't have enough troops to adequately adequately cover those areas, and it ended up with him distributing arms and food and clothing all over the Luzon island. And this became significant later on. So here's the troops landing at Lingayen Gulf. And about this time, it was determined, because of the huge amount of artillery and bombing that took place, the Philippine Army were basically unable to repel the landing. Then the 26th Cavalry, this is the Philippine Scouts. These are the men that bore the name of a cavalryman because they rode horses, not tanks. Nowadays, the cavalry apparently drive around in tanks, but in this is one of the last charge by a horse-mounted cavalry unit in the U.S. Army. It was accomplished by this group of men, and they received many awards for their efforts. They took some mostly observation situation here, trying to understand what was happening, but they were setting up some defensive positions also. The Philippine Army was attempting to establish some defense. Now, this is a lower picture of that same region. Here's Manila down here. Here's Lingayen Gulf. This is where the Japanese landed their 43,000 troops on Lingayen Gulf. And what happened is the rest of the 26th then were brought up and attempted to, and were directed to delay the action of the Japanese. And this went on for a couple of weeks, and they were able to give some impeding of the advancing of the Japanese, which were obviously heading for Manila. About this time, MacArthur concluded that his plan to protect Luzon was not working. And so he decided then that they would go into what was called Project Orange, which had been a plan set up years before, which would be to have all of the troops that were available moved into the Bataan Peninsula down here, and thus keep the Japanese still from Corregidor and therefore Manila Bay, therefore Manila. The problem with that is that a lot of the supplies had already been distributed, and the food, and it was all located in areas were not convenient to Bataan Peninsula, for example. So it was on the 24th of December through the 6th of January, the decision was made to move all the troops that were on Luzon, and as many as could be made available, into the Bataan Peninsula, with the idea of keeping the Japanese from eventually getting to Corregidor and controlling the Manila Bay. Now, so this is just an attempt to show you how the movement was taking place. Now, not only were troops being made available from Manila, for example, and south of Manila, but also there were like 26,000 civilians that were now planning to take advantage of the protection they were hoping for by moving into the Bataan Peninsula. So on January the 6th, I'm sorry. Okay, well, this first, I wanted to show you this picture. Much of Luzon is a very treacherous, mountainous, difficult region. And it's not you're not playing in the middle of the football field, you're traveling through jungle. And so by January the 6th, it was decided that the Americans would establish a defensive position at this region here on the Bataan Peninsula. And of course, there was Philippine Army, Philippine Constabulary, Philippine Scouts, were all in these regions then putting up the battle to keep the Japanese from coming further down the peninsula. Then by the 27th, these troops had found it necessary to retreat further, and so they established a line here, the Orion-Bagak line. And this was by the 27th of January. So the American and Filipinos had retained the Japanese for over 20 days. And it was important, of course, that these days be invested in delaying the Japanese, because this gave America some additional time to get their resources organized. Of course, one of the problems that the people who are fighting these battles in this area were so confronted with was the rumors that said, well, American has help on the way. The ships are coming. They're bringing food. They're bringing more troops. They're bringing more ammunition. But as it happened, really, Roosevelt had committed with Churchill that the commitments of the United States as far as such resources would be initially to the European sector. And so there was no help coming. There was no additional food. There was no additional ammunition. And but that had helped maintain the morale of these troops for a while. But as it became obvious that nothing was happening, it affected them militarily as well, physically and emotionally. So by April of 42, so a couple of months later, they had now been moved down to the southern tip of Bataan. Marivelis was the community here. Here's Corregidor, 19 miles across the bay. And so by April 42, it was essentially nothing more could be done. First, I'll cover a little bit about the structure of the organization. This is not a military OT&E, but gives you some idea. At this time, General MacArthur was now the supreme commander of the forces in the Pacific. General Wainwright had been elevated to be in charge of Luzon and Corregidor. And through him, General King was in charge of, was the commander of the North Luzon. In that, he had the Philippine civilians, the 26,000 that I mentioned, many US troops and personnel, the 4th Marines, the Philippine Scouts, 31st Infantry, other non-combat trained personnel, like a lot of the troops on Clark Field had been moved over there to into this area, and they'd been handed a rifle and said, no, you're not a maintenance aircraft man, you're an infantryman. Of course, the Philippine Army was here, the constabulary, and then there was the beginning of guerrilla groups. These groups were from primarily Filipinos, but some Americans that were able to escape from various areas and start establishing guerrilla efforts. In Corregidor, General Moore was in charge. The Coast Artillery units were here, Philippine Army, more Philippine Scouts, all of the medical people, and I shouldn't say that, most of the medical people and supplies, medical supplies had been moved to Corregidor. Then General Parker had the South Luzon Force and Philippine Army. Mike and I were able to talk to a man out at Westmoreland, I think it is, General Phillips. He had been a major in this region here, and he had became a prisoner of war also. So, and then there was General Sharp, who was in the Visay Mindanao force, and they had some Philippine Army and guerrillas. Okay, this is my other timeline. This is the one that really gets complicated. I have I show different events occurring, some done by the Japanese, and those were in red letters, some done by the American Filipinos, and they're done with green letters, and then some events are in white. So the Japanese, the Imperial Japanese Force, that's what the IJF is, they landed on Luzon, and I showed that earlier. Then the Japanese established their air superiority over the entire island. Then 45,000 more troops landed on Luzon in mid-December. And by Christmas, the American and Filipino troops were assembling on Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese then attacked with these American Filipino forces around the 1st of January. By the way, this is the date the Japanese had intended to have complete control of the Philippines, but they did not, because the American Filipino troops had delayed them to the point that they could not take over at that point. Then there's the first major battle at Layak Junction. And by this time, because the food situation was bad already, because as I mentioned earlier, much of the food that had been planned was not available for Bataan. And in the rush to move troops into Bataan, they were unable to move the food that had been distributed throughout Luzon. So on the middle of January, the troops, American Filipino troops, were reduced to half rations. That was about 2,000 calories, I think, which is not enough by any means to keep a military man carrying a 50-pound pack on his back and the weapons and ammunition and fighting the situation in the jungle. Then the Japanese increased their artillery raids and their aircraft raids. Then the American Filipino troops withdrew to the second line of defense that I showed you earlier. And the Battle of Abacay-Malban line was one of the big battle areas. Then later in February, they had a battle called the Battle of Pockets. And this was one of the most successful ones for the American Filipinos. They wiped out 3 of the divisions of the Japanese. And as a result, 3 of the regiments, the Japanese were then decided to withdraw. And General Homo, who was the commander of the Japanese, then requested of Tokyo that he be given more troops, that the troops would come in from Formosa, hopefully, and support him. In the meantime, about the 1st of March, General MacArthur was directed by the president to move his headquarters to Australia. MacArthur's wife and son were with him at that time. And there's quite a story about how that was accomplished by way of PT boat down to Mindanao and then aircraft from Mindanao. And so then the troops that had been requested by Homo were brought in from Formosa. These were physically good shape, well-fed, well-armed troops who had been in Formosa. By this time, the American Filipino troops were cut to quarter rations. Then the Japanese commenced their final offensive action. And the battle that was significant in the loss to what few troops were able to stand on the part of American Filipinos was here. And by this time, the decimated, malaria-ridden, starving with no ammo, American Filipino troops moved back toward Corregidor, the southern tip of Bataan Peninsula. And on the 9th of April in 1942, General King, despite commands from Wainwright and MacArthur to not surrender, General King decided to surrender all of the troops on Luzon because that was his command area. He felt that it was useless to continue, that they were unable to prevent anything except complete annihilation, not only of the troops, but also of the thousands of civilians that were still located on the island. A very tough decision on his part. So this began then after April 9th, the Bataan Death March. And that proceeded here. And then, of course, without any opposition now, the Japanese moved their artillery and troops down to the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula, and were now able to attack Corregidor completely. Then the POWs were then turned to move into Camp O'Donnell or O'Donnell. It's interesting, the story of why it was called O'Donnell is that the original Spanish family that was in there when Spain had the Philippines was O'Donnell. And the camp was named after them, but it was changed to O'Donnell. So many people, including us there, called it O'Donnell, but most people who are looking at this don't recognize that. So anyway, General Wainwright then on the 9th of May, against orders from MacArthur, concluded that he had to surrender, and he surrendered the Corregidor and the Philippines. So here in May then, it took from December to May for the Japanese to accomplish what they had said they could accomplish from December to January. Then it was because of the tremendous effort of the American Filipino troops in withholding and slowing the Japanese down to the point that it gave the Americans some additional 5 months to get things underway in the homeland efforts. Okay, this is a picture of General King here surrendering to the Japanese officer in charge at that time. It was not General Homo, but it was one of his underlings, Yamamoto, I believe was his name. And General King they tried to get General King to submit the whole of the Philippines, but he said he couldn't do that because they were not his command. His command was only the Luzon troops. There's an interesting story. The Japanese insisted that General King submit his sword as a surrender emblem, but he did not have his sword with him. So he had to submit and turn over his pistol. And the attempt when finally King gave full surrender, he asked that the prisoners that were captured would be well treated. The Japanese official made no comment to that effect. And we can see why. Okay, now we'll be looking at a land view here again. Manila's over here, Corregidor's down here, Bataan Peninsula. And we're now going to be following the Bataan Death March. This is the trail of the Bataan Death March. Now, of course, a lot of troops, when they were directed to surrender, I mean, General King said, lay down your arms, we are surrendering. There were a lot of men that did not want to, and some who did not, but most did obey the command to surrender their arms, but many of them were located in the mountain regions, and they had to move across the peninsula to join the Death March trail that went from Mariveles down here all the way up along the eastern shore of the peninsula up to the town of San Fernando. Then from San Fernando to the town of Capas, they were put into boxcars, and I'll show you more of that. And then from campus to Camp O'Donnell, a 9-mile hike into the camp. This is just some pictures of the Death March itself. They were just getting organized. You know, it ended up there were about 70,000 troops that were captured, the largest surrender of an American army in history, except perhaps that's excluding the Civil War. And of course, then there was a surrender at Corregidor. And in a way, it was very surprising for the Japanese. They only expected about 20,000 troops. So they really were ill prepared to handle 70,000. This is no excuse. I'm just pointing out that part of the issues that arose was because they really were not prepared to handle this many people. Okay, now, you know, I've got a lot of statistics, a lot of charts, and all that, but it really doesn't get to the heart of some of the situations that occurred. So what I did was I took some testimony from a couple of sources, and I've just actually quoted their reaction to what they saw. This is from Colonel Dias. Now, he's interesting because he was able to escape as a POW, and he escaped. Eventually was taken by submarine from the Philippines to Australia, where he then appeared before MacArthur, and MacArthur then insisted that he go to Washington and tell the people in Washington what was happening in the Philippines. So he is, I won't read all these words, you can see what he's saying, but they're, the physical condition of the American troops were unimaginable. They could hardly walk at many times. And there were times when there was action taken by the Japanese just out of spite, whacking somebody on the back of his head, nothing they had said or done, but it was just something that they could do. Then they would purposely run over Americans that had fallen, or Filipinos that had fallen in the path of the army that was coming and heading down to the Corregidor. I think he talks here about the sun cure, which was where they would stand the perpetrator in the sun for hours, nothing on their head. And as Major Dias said, he was a major at that time, it could break a strong man. And it was caused a lot of not only physical, but mental conditions to become severe. And he says that they were without food for 6 days, some to 12 days, and all without water except for a few sips dipped from the caribou wallows. Then this is another report from a group in the 91st Division of the Philippine Army, where the Japanese, for no reason, land up 35 to 400 Philippine officers and militia men, and then tied their hands behind their backs, then tied them to one another. Then with their backs to the captors, the Japanese interpreter addressed them in Tagalog. He said, "My friends, don't take it so hard. You must be patient. Had you surrendered earlier, you would not have met this tragedy." And then at the gave them signal, the officers started at one end and the enlisted officers started at the other end. The officers with sabers were actually cutting off the heads, beheading these Filipinos. And at the other end, the enlisted men were bayoneting them. And they'd go back and forth, making sure everybody was dead. It took about 2 hours. As it turned out, actually 2 men escaped. One died quite soon after that, but they were able to tell the story of what happened. All 350 to 400 men were shot for no reason at all, except that they were Filipinos that had fought the Japanese in return. This intent here is just to show where the prisoners came from and where they went. On Bataan, of course, they, by way of the Death March, went to Camp O'Donnell. Some escaped and became guerrillas. Most in Camp O'Donnell eventually went to Camp Tawan or were transported to Japan. Corregidor, they went to what was called Camp Tawan, and some then on to Japan or to various Philippine prisons that were located in the Philippines but were under Japanese control. South Luzon and Mindanao. Many of these troops went to Manchuria and were enlisted as slave labor to build railroads, clear trails, highways, and so forth. They were treated as slaves. Some went to Japan directly, put into work in factories, and they were treated as dogs, not as humans. This is a picture you saw earlier on the beginning. It was created, and a copy of this painting is available. It was made available by Victor Fulford to show. It was created based on the word conduct from Major Dias, the one I mentioned earlier, showing how the men that were in the march were unable to do anything to support or to help someone who had fallen. And in this case, showed a tank swerving purposely to run over someone who had fallen. Another thing that I like this picture for is to show the trail of the thousands and thousands of men that were heading off to the prison camps. You know, I don't know if you could liken it to a situation, let's say, where they took everybody in Bronco Stadium, had them lined up to 4 abreast, and start marching them to Colorado Springs. No water, no food, maybe a handful of rice, but that's all. Oh, leave all your son, no drinks, nothing like that. Just marching to Colorado Springs on a day in good, nice weather is under difficult enough. I'll put it that way. These are pictures showing some of the prisoners after they had been captured, after they'd laid down their arms. Then, of course, there were the strip searches, all the personal hardware, watches, pens, billfolds, pictures were taken by the Japanese interrogators as they were being searched by the Japanese. Then, this of course shows some of the dead bodies that died during the Death March itself. And of course, there were many more than this. Getting back to the Death March, a picture from the Death March, this showing the march from Mariveles, which is on the southern tip of Bataan, to San Bernardino, was about 3 to 6 days. No water, no food, hot, just marching. Then they were shoved in these boxcars where they couldn't sit or lay down. They were standing, dying, and defecating, but they were then there for 1 to 2 days. Then after that, they had the 9-mile march to Camp O'Donnell. So let's just give you an extra time for how long it took, the 65 to 85-mile trek to Camp O'Donnell. We'll give some statistics. Estimate of those that captured on Bataan was about 10,000, and Filipinos about 60,000 troops. Of those who died in the Death March, about 650 Americans and 18,000 Filipinos. These are just some pictures of some of the prisoners after the death march and showing their physical condition. This is the burial detail at Camp O'Donnell. Every day as the men in the camp died, which were many a day, as many as almost 60 a day, then other men were enlisted to carry those bodies out to the graveyard, to dig the graves and to dump the bodies. And if they were too tired themselves, too weak to do much more, then they were just given the opportunity to fall in the grave themselves. And you can see that the graves were not deep. And of course, when rain came, which is then the bodies would be exposed. And I guess that's enough said about that. This is a picture taken about 1945 of the graveyard and the condition that existed at that time. Of course, since that time, a lot has been done to move bodies into the National Cemetery on the Philippines, to identify the bodies. There were great attempts on the part of the officers to identify men as they died, to identify the dates that they died, identify where they were buried, but it was difficult, to say the least. And of course, with the Filipinos, it got almost unimaginable. The burial detail was essentially in the Philippines, with the Filipinos, was a continuous string of march, parade of the Death March. Okay, so estimated how many died at Camp O'Donnell alone. Now you got to realize that the Americans were in a separate sector in the camp from the Filipinos. The Japanese had separated them. So the Americans, 1,270 died, and that number is pretty accurate because Captain Olson was maintaining records, and he was able to supply this number. In the case of the Filipinos, it's estimated about 20,000. There were no well-kept records of that, but it's estimated that there were that many who died in the camp. I mean, the conditions there were terrible. To cover what happened in the camp itself would take a day. The atrocities that took place, the conditions that were there, the dysentery, the lack of any health conditions at all. This is a chart showing the cumulative death rate that was occurring amongst the American soldiers in Camp O'Donnell. First, the prisoners arrived here right after the surrender, and then after the death rate became so serious and the Japanese could do nothing about it, then they started moving men out of Camp O'Donnell into other camps, primarily Camp Bataan, which is fairly close. So the question is, well, what was the cause of death? The primary cause that was recorded was dysentery. I only show three: malaria, and then other. But this doesn't count dehydration, starvation, beriberi, ulcers, the thousands of other conditions that exist in a condition where there's no health, and the conditions are so severe with the latrines, growing maggots, growing mosquitoes, making it to the point that even as if they got any rice at all, they could hardly get it down before the insects and so forth would get to it. Okay, I was able to identify in the prisoners that were died in Camp O'Donnell that over 300 of them were actually identified Colorado as their home. Of these, 109 died at the hand of the Japanese. So almost 40% of the Coloradans that were incarcerated in Camp O'Donnell died at the hands of the Japanese. So I've identified also where many of them actually died. Camp Tawan, which I'll talk about more, is a larger camp that the O'Donnell campers were moved to, prisoners were moved. Many were executed. Many died in Camp O'Donnell, as I said earlier. Many went on to Japanese camps in the Philippines and in Japan and in Manchuria. And then there's the unknown. Many of these died in what we believe to be called the hell ships. And I won't cover that, but that's a story in itself, where many of the prisoners were transported into transport ships, with the intent to move them to Japan or Manchuria, for example, and enlist them as slave labor. And but because the ships were unmarked, they were often shot on by American submarines who had now gained access to some of these waters. And as a result, the ships went down, and the Americans actually died in the ships as they sunk at the hands of American firing, because the Japanese had not marked them as. Further, there were other incidents where the hatch, of course, the conditions on the ship were terrible, much like the boxcars earlier, but men dying right there, defecating there, and they were down in the hold. And when the ship was hit with a torpedo, the Japanese opened the gate up above and took the machine guns and fired into the troops that were down below. They didn't want them to escape. I mean, what a logic. The intent here is to show that the story of what was happening in the Philippines wasn't known in the United States proper until 1944. And this was partly because of the effort on part of Major Diaz, where he went to MacArthur, and MacArthur sent him to the US. And so it was at that point that the American press finally found out. At this point, they thought it was 50,000. The number, of course, went up to 70,000 troops were taken by the Japanese. But America did not know for so long. And of course, it was only after this that then the Americans began to realize that something more effort had to be done. General Blumall was a prisoner of war. He had been mutilated in prison, been kicked and stomped on, and but he survived and was eventually able to return to the United States. But after coming back, he felt like Congress and the War Department were now no longer concerned about what happened to all those that were involved in Bataan and Corregidor, and that the peacetime routine had bypassed in honor and compensation those of Bataan and Corregidor, who fought so valiantly with outdated equipment against overpowering, well-equipped, brutal Japanese forces. Okay, this is the timeline showing the recapture of the Philippines. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but this is the MacArthur did return, as he said he would, in October of 1944. So 2 years after the Philippines had surrendered. Then they landed, the Americans landed in Leyte Gulf, just as the Japanese had. They landed in Luzon. The 6th Army, the 7th Major Fleet, the 7th Fleet landed. At this point here in January, the Japanese officials in Tokyo issued an order to the commanders of all the camps to kill the prisoners, to kill all of the Americans and Filipino prisoners. As a result of that, the Americans undertook an action, which I'll discuss in some detail, by raiding Camp Tawan at great sacrifice on the part of those who did this at rescue. And they were able to rescue and release the prisoners at Camp Tawan. Then in March, US troops recaptured Manila, what little was left of it. Fort Drum, which was in the bay, was eliminated. The 8th Army recaptured Mindanao, which is a big southern island. Then there was the cleanup of the remaining Japanese troops that were still on Luzon, for example, and many of the other islands. Then in August, US dropped the bomb, and in September, Japan surrendered. This is a picture taken of those prisoners that had been in Camp Cabanatuan, and this was taken after their release from the prison. It was in January of 1945, and I won't go into detail of it. Many of you probably saw the movie showing how these men were rescued and saved by this effort of a group of rangers and scouts that had to go over 30 miles across and behind Japanese lines to reach the camp. And they, of course, it was interesting. Many of these men were keeping records of what was happening, and they were keeping records on pieces of scrap paper they could find, and the wrappings of some of the canned food that they were able to get. And so some of the records that describe the conditions, not only in the camps, but also on the Death March itself, came from these men who were documented. In one case, a lieutenant had kept records, and he had given these records to a friend of his and asked him to bury those records in the grounds at the camp. They were later recovered. The lieutenant himself was later killed off of one of the hell ships, but the records were found and were later distributed to his family. And of course, it was a great deal of personal information that were supplied through efforts like that. General MacArthur made a comment about the sacrifices that were accomplished by those who withheld the Japanese during the Battle of Bataan. Okay, in this picture, you see a picture of a Philippine company with Philippine troops and an American officer who happens to have the name of Frank Francone. That's me standing ahead of my company there. These are Filipino officers and then Filipino troops in the back here of this company. Turns out one of these Filipino officers, his name is Lieutenant Alejandro Nasis. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a minute here. But the Philippines were basically a new Philippine group. This regiment that I was in was the 57th Infantry Regiment, which was one of the regiments that fought in the battles on Bataan. But of course, that regiment kind of disappeared during the war and then was reformed after the war with the intent to participate in the invasion of Japan. Of course, that was before the end of the war. Participate in the occupation, then to mop up stragglers. And the only problem is that in 1947, Truman disbanded the Philippine Scouts as an official element of the United States Army. And of course, part of the reason is in 46, the United States the Philippines had been a Commonwealth of the United States. The US had promised to release them from that Commonwealth, and in 46, and the United States carried out that promise in 46. So now in the Philippines, you had a Philippine army, and you had an army of foreigners who were basically in the United States Army. Now, many of these men were still Filipinos, but they were part of the United States Army. This is a memorial in Camp O'Donnell that lists those that died there. I mentioned earlier some of the issues about they were not being supported. There was no help. The poem became very popular. It was no mama, no mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. And that was a big morale factor for these troops. I won't give you all the details of this, but basically this is in 2005, 2015, I'm sorry, Congress passed a regulation awarding a congressional gold medal to those that were in the Philippines during the period from 42 to 1946. And this describes the criteria for who would be eligible. It's much more detailed than this, but this is a general description. This is a model of the Congressional Gold Medal itself, and you'll see a larger rendition of that in the picture behind Mike Simbry when he comes on here in just a couple of minutes. I want to point out one issue that I've been particularly interested in was making an attempt to locate surviving veterans or families of those who were POWs who might in fact be eligible for a Congressional Gold Medal. So I was able to locate about 212 veterans or families. I attempted to locate many. I was able to locate 59 of those families, and there was one surviving veteran living in California that was in that group of 59. But I was unable to contact 153 families. Of those 59 that I located, it turned out that none of them knew about the gold medal or the fact that they might be eligible for that, or the recognition for the sacrifice that had been made by their ancestor. And of course, I think it's important because it's not only for that family and individual, but for their grandchildren to know the sacrifice and to recognize what can happen. Okay, I'm sorry, let's go, okay. The question is, how can you help? Basically, and Mike will cover this some, but there has been an effort on the part of this Phil Vet Rep organization to get Congress to approve the regulation to allow these gold medals, but also to conduct the services for it, to locate the families, and now to set up educational funds to train not only survivors of these families, but also the US population, high school students and so forth. So, okay, now this is a short video that I'll show here to explain much of what I've covered in much more detail. Let's see, I don't hear the sound.
All right. So Frank, if you want to pause the video, I can show you how to share the sound.
Let's see, let me,
Frank, do you want to pause the video? I can show you how to share the sound.
here we go, I got it now. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah.
That was Senator Paul Ryan, or Representative Paul Ryan there.
With the winds of war blowing in the Pacific, President Roosevelt uses his constitutional authority on July 26, 1941, and orders into service of the United States all of the organized military forces of the Philippines.
Everyone knows about Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, but perhaps lesser known is that within hours, Japanese forces also invaded the Philippines. 250,000 Filipinos answered President Roosevelt's call to duty.
Many enlisted knowing full well that the enemy could discover who they were and retaliate against their families. These loyal and courageous soldiers fought bravely, sacrificed greatly, many even paying the ultimate price.
Every Filipino who went to the war was made to understand that we were fighting not only for our country, but also for the American people.
The 260,000 Filipino men and women who fought under the American flag were vital to the Allied victory.
Those brave men who promised citizenship and fair compensation bravely took up arms, who fought alongside American soldiers on the beaches of far-flung islands, who suffered the unspeakable brutality of Japanese POW camps, and died alongside American soldiers in the infamous Bataan Death March.
The casualties during this one-week march without food or water are staggering. Nearly 700 Americans and close to 10,000 Filipinos perish.
In resistance, they held aloft the spirit of a people for all the world to see, unbent, standing tall, enduring still.
MacArthur returns with the U.S. Armada in October 1944, and the combined forces of the U.S. troops and Filipino guerrillas quickly rout the Japanese.
In return for their valor and sacrifice, the American government promised them citizenship and the benefits entitled to all veterans. In 1946, however, Congress, sadly, shamefully, reneged on this promise and refused to grant these veterans the citizenship and benefits they earned. But even in the face of such adversity, these veterans never gave up. They organized and fought for what they had earned. In 1990, after decades of advocacy, Congress finally fulfilled President Roosevelt's promise and awarded American citizenship to these veterans. We honor them as an inseparable part of the fabric of our community and our country.
Let this ceremony serve to ensure that those who fought for freedom are never forgotten and are always remembered.
This is a story that needs to be told again and again so that our country does not forget.
I am Celestino Almeida, a 100-year-old veteran of World War II. The saying goes, old soldiers never die. They just fade away.
I want my grandchildren and their grandchildren to know this story of courage and duty to country. Future generations must never forget why we are able to live our way of life today. We must always remember.
the point here is that it's easy to say, well, the Congressional Gold Medal was fine, but it's just, to me, it's just the beginning of the necessity to maintain the legacy that was established by these freedom fighters, and to carry that legacy to the point that it's understood by generations yet to come. I just have a couple of sites here that you can identify, locate information, much more detailed than I've already given. And this is the Phil Vet Rep sites that you can access on your internet to find out more about it. If Mike's talk it makes you more interested. Okay. Okay, I am going to now close my screen. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Frank. And if everybody wants to come back to gallery view here and find Mike and unmute him, or Mike, you may unmute yourself.
I'm having a little trouble understanding you, Amy. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I was looking for Mike. Hi, Mike. If you're still here, if you want to unmute yourself and address the.
Okay,
I'm looking for him.
can you hear me now?
He's here. There you are.
Okay, all right.
Perfect.
Okay, it's my spill now. Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Frank for his great presentation about the Bataan Death March. I want to thank you, Amy, for being the host. And I want to thank all of you on here for being here, to watch this presentation. Again, my name is Mike Sembre, and I belong to the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. Okay, and I call it, we abbreviated PhilVet Rep for short. There's two things I want to let you guys know about this project. First of all, the word recognition. We have worked hard to give recognitions to the World War II veterans who fought in the Philippines with the Congressional Gold Medals, the highest award Congress can bestow on an individual or a group that made significant difference in the history of the United States. And I don't know if you can see this. Let me see if I bring it up to the camera, bring it back. This is the medal that's awarded. Okay, I see that there are two people here, Jerry Neri and John Miramore online, and you were awarded this for your father and I believe your uncle, in April of 2018. But this is the medal that we award to the veterans or their next of kin. Okay, and there are pictures behind me that's the same thing as this. Okay, that was phase one of our project. Okay, the bill was signed by President Obama. I mean, the bill was signed by President Obama, designed by PhilVet Rep, and officially awarded on October 25th. The word Filipino is a misnomer, by the way. It is for all the veterans that fought in the Philippines, whether you were white, black, Australian, but you were deserving of the medal. And of course, Frank, as you can see, was awarded the medal also. Okay. We have awarded over 3,000 medals since the incept of this medal, since the beginning. If you guys know anyone that may qualify for the medal, please let Frank or I know, or go to our website, philvetrep.com, for more information. And there's an application in there, and it tells you who you are. The second part, or phase two, is the educational part of our project. We have launched a web-based education site that gives the great history of the United States and the Philippines, past, present, and the future. Our target now is really for the 11th graders, scholars, and college students, but it's open to the public. Okay, in textbooks nowadays, you see in high school, you see MacArthur left and MacArthur came back, and they don't show anything about what happened. Jerry Neri, that's online right now, his father was an underground American that actually was very instrumental in bringing MacArthur back. Right, Jerry? Oh, you can't, I can't hear you. Anyway,
Yeah.
Is that better? There. Can you
Yeah.
hear me now?
yes.
Okay, I had to unmute. My father and many other Filipino Americans were
Mhm.
part of that endeavor to try provide intelligence for MacArthur so that they could have a successful return to the Philippines and take it back over. But I just want to say I really appreciate Frank and your efforts in keeping this story alive, and also that Frank, with his personal experience, I don't think, hopefully, people will listen to this, and like you say, grandsons, grandkids, great grandkids will hopefully not forget this. I just want to show my appreciation to everybody and everyone's effort to keep this alive.
Okay, and this website, it just shows the lessons of honor, duty, patriotism, and valor for these soldiers, and the injustice and discrimination of the Rescission Act of 1946. There are many people out here that know about the Bataan March, but few know about the Rescission Act that took everything away from the veteran. But this site will educate you and perpetuate the legacies of these veterans. Which brings us back to the Rescission Act. PhilVetRep has plans to rescind that act. However, it takes a lot of effort because it's a 75-year-old act. And we have to take it apart and we have to give it to the congressional people to sponsor the bill to Congress. Another thing that we do for PhilVetRep is the Bataan Memorial Death March, which is held at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Usually it's done in March or April. It's a 14.2 miler or a 26 miler. And I go there for the last 3 years or so. It was canceled last year. And this year it was a virtual one. Frankie and I did a 6 miler on April 9th to celebrate the surrender of the Philippines. And the PhilVetRep group up in DC and I did it here. I did it here. They did it locally up at DC. So anybody that is interested in doing the march, well, 14.2 mile, it's a simple marathon back in the desert, dusty, everything, but it's supposed to be fun and it's very challenging. So anybody who wants to participate in it, please let me know. I need somebody to carry me across the finish line, please. Okay. We are a donation, and lastly, we are a donation-driven organization. All donations here go 100% to the medals, the upkeep of the education site, and administration costs. We are all volunteers here. And I mean the people nationwide. If you want to donate, please go to the website philvetrep.org. If you want to donate to Frank or myself personally, we'll make sure that they get the donation. You will get a receipt for your donations, and all donations are fully tax deductible. We're a 501c organization. That's all I have. I do thank everybody again. Again, if anybody knows that of anyone that qualified for the medal, let Frank and I know. And right now, we like to entertain any questions that anyone would have. And thank you, Jerry, for telling us about what your dad did. And thank you, Amy.
Yeah, of course.
Mhm.
And we did have one question that popped up on the chat a while ago, Frank. So it was about an hour ago it popped up. And it was specifically asking, it was from Jeffrey. And he was asking about, he says, I'm getting the picture that the Japanese landed over 100,000 troops total, but I didn't understand how many troops the US and Philippine armies have to try to defend.
Well,
Not sure if that makes sense to you.
as far as we
Jeffrey,
know,
you can ask him directly.
can you hear me? Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
The Americans and the Filipino troops were about 70,000 as was identified. The problem is that they had World War I weapons in many cases. They were not well trained, except for those few troops like the Philippine scouts. And so to compare numbers is really not fair because you're comparing apples and oranges. The
Yeah. I-
Japanese were so well prepared physically, food wise, ammunition wise, clothing wise, and it just overwhelmed the American and Filipino troops.
Yes, I did get that understanding after a while. I mean, I asked the question,
Okay.
but after a while, I understood that, I mean, they were up against impossible odds. I mean, they had lost air superiority. They didn't have any air cover. They were inadequately supplied, 1/2 rations, 1/4 rations after a while,
Right.
malaria. I mean, it's amazing that they were able to defend themselves for, even a month, let alone 5 months.
Yeah,
But it didn't
Right.
matter how many they had, they didn't have a chance.
yeah. Thanks, Jeff.
Right on.
May I offer my appreciation for Frank, walking behind him on the minor token Bataan Death March was an honor, and also walking beside Michael, who did threaten to come back with Frank, and he actually did, and we had what I thought was very serious and humorous, well orchestrated conversations, and it was a joy meeting both of them, and of course Miss Amy, who's cooking the books all the time.
Excellent. Excellent. Any other questions here for Frank and or Michael? All right.
All right.
Thank you all very much again for coming here today to listen to this excellent presentation. Thank you, Frank and Michael and all of you. So
All
have
right.
a great rest of the evening.